Vítám vás po obědové přestávce.
Jiří Šitler, good to meet you.
Pan velvyslanec se ještě dopředstaví.
Welcome back. We are going to have a 1.5-hour panel now on human rights and prosperity. And we are going to speak about this borderline area between focusing on human rights on one hand and then interests in one's own prosperity on the other hand. And we are going to speak about prosperity in the economic sense of the word. Our guests on the panel, from their own experience and from their professional experience, have much to say. We have here Sinologist Olga Lomová, who is the head of the Far East Institute at the Faculty of Arts at Charles University in Prague. Next to her, the Russian journalist and a critic of the Russian regime. He was designated as a prisoner of conscience by Amnesty International, Mr. Grigory Pasko. And last but not least, historian and a diplomat, presently an ambassador of the Czech Republic to Sweden, Mr. Jiří Šitler. The composition of the panel is quite simple. You have already seen the same setup in the morning. And I will ask our panelists to deliver an opening remark of about 10 minutes, and then a discussion will follow. Mrs. Lomová, please, Professor Lomová. First of all, thank you for inviting me here. I would like to thank to the organizers for having this conference in the first place. And then I would like to thank Mr. Erwin Kotler, the keynote speaker. His speech was very impressive, very much to the point and precise, and it reminded us of many things that we tend to forget about our day-to-day business. And I very much appreciate this address, and I would like to see it published so that many people could read it, because it reminded us of some key elements, key issues that are of key importance, but we tend to forget those in our daily lives. I have several questions or comments to make which put prosperity and human rights into some sort of juxtaposition. And we should first think about the notion of prosperity. This is not a very straightforward notion. I was looking the word up in a dictionary, and there are a number of synonyms. You can think of prosperity in the material sense of the word, material development, economic development of the society, and I think this is the key question here today. Then we have prosperity that goes beyond the immediate economic benefits, something that looks at the society in a longer horizon, over a longer period of time, and it's overall prospering, and it's the long-term prosperity, not only economic one. And I will speak about the instant prosperity, the economic prosperity. And when I was first thinking about what to speak on here, the first idea that came to my mind was as follows. When we think about human rights, myself and all thinkers of all kinds, I think there is something that is not measurable, because human rights are something that comes from the realm of the morals, something that goes beyond instant material gratification or prosperity, and it stands on a different level in my mind than economic prosperity. And this is not to say that we should not care about economic prosperity, but these are two different notions that are very difficult to measure against one another. It's very problematic to do so. And what I say may sound as some sort of preaching when I speak about human rights standing above the mundane economic prosperity. This is not what I want to come off as. We know that human rights in the basic dimension of human rights are key and more important than anything else. And as was said in this keynote speech, the one I so much appreciated, this is something that we teach our children. We do not teach our children you have to gain as much as possible. We teach them you have to be nice to the others. And this is the basis of what human rights are about, even though sometimes they become somewhat abstract and detached from reality. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights mentions prosperity. It mentions the human right, or right of a person to dignified life, to prosperity, but it is not mentioned as something that would be conditioning human rights. And what we have to keep in mind that in societies when human rights are protected, these are societies which are prosperous societies. But the question is whether there is a causal nexus, a causal relation between the two. And from the recent times, we have the example of China, which is the subject of my academic research. And in China, we see economic development, material development, and prosperity, perhaps, is accompanied by a great departure from the idea of human rights. And human rights is something that was not foreign in China. It was well received and understood. Human rights today, however, in China are seen as something that a modern society, prosperous society, does not need. So what I think is that we need to go back to the basics and realize what human rights are, and we should not replace human rights with economic prosperity. From my own experience, I believe that a human society becomes more and more pragmatic, that is focused on prosperity, and it thinks about the importance of human rights less and less, perhaps because we have them, so we think that this is something we don't have to strive for, and instead we strive for material prosperity. And to close my introduction, I say something that sort of picks up on the previous panel. Those regimes where human rights are not honored and where they are belittled as a value, these are regimes that understand their universality. Sorry, we have lost the microphone. Sorry, I don't have the sound. I'm very sorry. We have the sound back again. Thank you. What we see here today, it may be an information crusade or educational crusade aiming at the ultimate objective is something, and that is that people should be more preoccupied with economic prosperity and neglect human rights. And I think it need be that we speak about these values, that we talk about them, discuss them, and educate our children in the same vein. Thank you, Professor. I have a lot of questions to ask, and I hope the same goes for you, and we can save those after the next two speakers. Mr. Pasko, your 10 minutes.
Vypadá to, že ano.
Хорошо. А переводит кто-то меня переводит?
Vy možno говорить по-русски.
Хорошо. Значит, я хотел бы сказать, что в буклете, который у вас есть, там...
I want to say that there is a mistake in the brochure. It says that I've been imprisoned for 2 years. It was 3 years. It doesn't look like a difference, but it is. It was 2 years spent in prison under Yeltsin, and sometimes after that 1 year under Putin. That was the most stringent type of prison. I have studied human rights in prison and in the camp. I know the theory and in practice. Theory is contradictory to practice. You find out that everything that's written in the legislation varies from what you can rely on if you're a journalist, and independent journalist in particular. Independent, that is really something irrigating for the authorities. And when I've was set free based on the decision of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, I have not reached any truth, and I'm still supposed to be a Japanese spy in Russian Federation. One Russian newspaper has written, a journalist of a Russian origin studied in the US, a Japanese spy has registered a Czech organization and funded by a Czech entity carries out propaganda against Putin's regime. But we are investigative journalists. There are no borders to such journalism. The subject matter of investigative journalism is, for instance, corruption. And here in the Czech Republic, we can see that Russian mafia is flourishing in various places and towns. It's very prosperous. Our fund that has been registered here in the Czech Republic, it is the Association of Investigative Journalists, organizes workshops in the Czech Republic. Why here? We have been established in 2009 in Russia, and we were proclaimed to be an enemy foreign agent. Why? Because we have invited people to present who were critical vis-à-vis the regime and created a negative image of Russian power. Let me name the experts we have invited to our workshops. Boris Akunin, Lyudmila Ulitskaya, Ruslan Agamadov, people, writers, people well known across the world. And we have also invited Czech journalists, people from OECC, CRP. They raised the awareness of Panama offshores. You probably heard about the accounts. So we were simply forced to get registration in Prague. We continue our activities in Russia, where we are still intimidated. I was beaten. We were placed a white powder, and announcement was made that there are bombs in our institute. Now I focus on two phenomenons. Empowered Russian aggression in the Czech Republic. Yesterday, I presented a lecture on a forum focused on Russia, and there we've agreed with my colleagues that these groups will be financed and will intimidate us. And we decided to create International School of Journalism in Prague that will pick up the human rights issues as well as counter propaganda departments. Putin's Munich speech started this cold period. Please, if you're interested, have a look at it, read it. I didn't want to talk about it, but after hearing Eva Romancovova on one of the panels who has mentioned it, we see that these are the propaganda officers who praise Putin regime based on a long-term visa here in the Czech Republic. And when I represent my organization, who's based here, and it is a taxpayer in the Czech Republic, I applied for a long-term visa, and I was said that I would get the decision in 60 days. 60 days period has expired, and I have no reaction whatsoever. So, as Václav Havel used to say, hope doesn't mean that everything will turn out well. Hope means that the effort is worthwhile regardless of the result. Thank you.
Grigory Pasko
Grigory Pasko and his experience. And now the Czech ambassador to Stockholm, Mr. Jiří Šitler, the floor is yours. Let me follow up Professor Lomová, prosperity versus human rights. And let me also follow up the dark vision or dark evaluation of the current environment. As Professor Lomová said, there is a global, and she mentioned China, but I think that we may include even the environment in the Czech Republic. There is a global debate, and the topic of prosperity is perceived as something standing above the human rights. So let's have a look at it from the legal point of view. It is the other way around. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights that the professor mentioned is generally valid. It should be valid on a general level. And when it has been drafted, there was a Chinese contribution, Indian contribution to it. It's not a product of Western thinking, of the Western world. Of course, this declaration should be universal and valid globally. It is a mere theory today. China, back in 2009, during the negotiations on the framework agreement between China and the EU. I want to say People's Republic of China and the EU. It was during the Czech presidency of the EU. I've chaired the Committee for Asia in the Brussels, and China has rejected a reference to the General Declaration of Human Rights in the preamble, although they are the UN member, etc. So they are diminishing it. This suggests that some countries would like to marginalize the declaration. And unfortunately, in this context, we have to say that it is the national states, countries, who should really supervise the conformity with Human Rights Charter. So, and we don't have many instruments that would help us to provide for compliance with human rights principles. Prosperity, development of business. It is very simple to leave countries that give more stringent legislation. It is very easy in this global environment. They can leave elsewhere, to China, to any of the African countries, or Myanmar, to mention a country where I've been active. And if the countries for whom the ethical aspect remains important, and I believe that it is the EU member states, US, and other countries that perceive human rights as a cornerstone, as an important aspect, although we can see erosion of this aspect as well. But question is whether these countries who insist on human rights may influence the corporate behavior. Corporations who move to countries where human rights are not so enforced, whether the countries can somehow improve the situation globally. Well, the debate has started in the 90s. And the focus was how to influence the corporations and businesses who do not fall under the General Declaration. And of course, Global Compact, UN, and other initiatives started to emerge. And these initiatives associated the corporations who promised to comply with human rights in their business. Well, but there's this blue washing aspect, right? You use the UN label, the business looks wonderful, and the reality may be very different. Later on, the debate arrived at a conclusion that we need a tool of supervision over the businesses, and the Human Rights Council, UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, adopted general principles for business and human rights, which stipulates an obligation of the countries to see to conformity with human rights, and the requirements there are kind of educational. They insist on the companies to introduce internal guidelines and procedures in place for breaches of human rights principles, etc. All that is effective only to an extent. Various countries, the EU member states in particular, have adopted action plans to supervise the activities of their businesses. Sweden has adopted such plan in 2015. In the Czech Republic, it is still work in progress. The plan has been finalized and it is ready to be approved by the government. The documents are being translated and the plan says that managers should be educated, local universities should
nebo i samostatně, tak tam
tutor human rights, ethics in business, and today in the Czech Republic there is a criminal liability of legal entities. Czech businesses may be brought before court if they breach human right on the level of criminal law. I tried to identify any such case, and although it is theoretically possible, I have not identified any such case in the Czech Republic. But there are international cases. Total, French-Belgium company, has been charged for the breach of human rights. It was forced labor and relocation of village inhabitants. So they were sued with Belgian and French courts, and out-of-court settlement was the result. The company has to pay an amount exceeding 5 million euro. However, they claimed that they were innocent. In Niger Delta, companies that were active there were also brought before courts. There were very many litigations and suits. So there are possibilities. And Czech legislation also provides for a disqualification of a respective manager. And it says that in particular cases, such manager will not be allowed to be a member of boards, be it a supervisory board or a board of directors, in a case of breach of human rights. And the action plan also assumes that this policy will be spread over more branches. And of course there are states who still marginalize the human rights aspect, and the other states promote it. And they have tools available. It is possible to do something, and let us hope that our government, the new government that will be formed after the elections, will approve the document and support this development in the corporate sphere. And let us hope that we will have this little tool. We will see. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you, Your Excellency.
Musím jenom říct, že ty případy...
I have to say that those cases you mentioned, or some of the borderline cases, which could be possible even under the Czech law, that is human rights violations by corporations could be prosecuted under Czech law. This is the highest level we're speaking about, but the broader sense is more not legal tools, but sort of an inclination by the governments to promote human rights. But it's just general atmosphere or general perception of human rights. And what I'd like to know from you, where the prosperity, economic prosperity, and human rights are indeed in contradiction. Ambassador? When I was active either as an ambassador or a director of a specific department here in Prague in Southeast Asia or Eastern Asia, I do not recall that our positions regarding human rights, which were quite rigid then. I do not recall that these positions we had taken then would have harmed a Czech company doing business there. So in that sense, it is not in contradiction. Do you agree, Professor? Yes, I do agree, and maybe I wasn't clear early on. The problem is not that if we respect human rights and honor human rights, appreciate human rights, that it would mean that we cannot have economic prosperity. That's not the contradiction or the contrast. The problem is that because of the failure to fully understand all interconnections, and due to typical human selfishness, we just are silent and shy away from human rights violations. Sometimes we make excuses for that, pointing to cultural differences, and we hope this is going to guarantee or give us economic prosperity. Indeed, it is possible that in those countries where human rights are violated, money can be made easily. There are great opportunities in these countries. So two different things come together here. On one hand, you have the conviction that profit is above all, and therefore the instant prosperity for the company is above all, and therefore it is desirable to set human rights aside. And this is the type of discussion that we hear among common people, that in the short-term interest of business, you can set human rights aside. On the other hand, companies do take advantage of this, and they try to say, and they say that they create jobs, create economic prosperity, and they do that regardless of human rights, again, in the interest of human prosperity. Mr. Pasko, how high stand human rights in Russia as opposed to prosperity?
I don't know.
Pokud mohu požádat tlumočníka, aby přetlumočil moji otázku ještě jednou, budu rád. Moje školní ruština tomuhle nedostačuje.
A тут не русский.
The moderator, I'll ask for the translation into Russian one more time. We need the Russian channel to be operational as well.
Teď slyšíte překlad?
Slyšíte?
No, já слушаю, нету. 1, 2, 3, 4. Два канала, нету ни...
Вопрос, если в России, что важнее, экономика или человеческие права? Вот этот вопрос.
Значит, очень хорошее название, что и права, и процветание, да, если про prosperity.
I think this is a good juxtaposition, human rights and prosperity. Many times I did write articles about companies doing business, and when you look at them, human rights were violated at different levels, starting with district courts to higher courts and even higher levels, and now they leave Russia and live in other countries, France or Spain. They pay taxes there, they create jobs there, and the question is, where is prosperity? They don't create prosperity in Russia. I do not see it there. I do not see it in Russia. The condition of the economy is very bad, especially after the sanctions have been introduced. And those people who cannot have their rights protected, rights to do business, leave the country and do business elsewhere. These are people who leave the country, who are educated, who are entrepreneurial and could do something good for their country. But the situation in country is such, it's a kleptocratic state, a state that steals from the businesses what these businesses produce themselves. I'm not speaking about those people who gained their riches in dubious ways at auctions and so forth, but I'm speaking about those who are honest businessmen who started from scratch, built a functional company. These people are successful, they got rich, and then after they got rich, they were visited by people from the Ministry of Interior or from the secret police, and they were asking them to give up on their business. The difference from the 19th century bandits is in that they come to a finished company, successful company, and they eat it from within, devour it, and discard it. These bandits in the past, they had to do something extra in exchange for money from businesses, and businesses gave them the money in the 1990s, and they were providing them with protection in exchange for that. But these new bandits from the secret police or from the Ministry of Interior, that's what they do. They steal companies from successful businessmen. And how is economy going to prosper? It cannot prosper because there is not functional judiciary. Courts do not protect ordinary men. They do not protect these businesses. If you ask me what should be done first, whether freedom of speech or independence of judiciary, I would vote for the independence of judiciary. Human rights are linked to prosperity, not only of one person, but the whole company, the whole society. I'd like to pick up on what Mrs. Lomová said. She said that these companies do not need to respect human rights. They may not have to do that, but they need, at the same time, they need an environment in that country, an environment of the rule of law. They need security for their investments. So they need that security. So it is not the case that it would be the best and most beneficial for those companies to come to territories or jurisdictions where there is no guarantee of elementary rights, because then they themselves can easily lose their business. Yes, you said so, Mr. Šitler. You said that if it's the national states that oversee human rights, then it is quite simple. If we decide that from the perspective of human rights, China is a problematic country, then should Czech companies do business in China? Should such business be encouraged and supported from the level of the government in a way, in the manner that will have organized trips of government officials and businessmen to China, and that government officials will open the doors for the businesses there? This is the question. I will answer by giving you an example that I know quite well, such as Burma, but we can also speak about Singapore, for instance, where their human rights record is not the greatest. However, they have functioning judiciary, and it is no shame to do business there. But in Burma, there are many companies that are co-owned by the army that commits the worst human rights violations. So the business which wants to go to Burma has to understand who to work with, who not to work with. If they work with companies that are linked to the army, and if they do business with those, then it is not an ethical business. But if it's not that type of enterprise, you have a number of normal functioning businesses there that have nothing to do with human rights violations by the Burmese army. So then it's okay. I think we have to distinguish here. You cannot have a sort of a blanket answer to everything. Well, I'm not going to say that we shouldn't do business with China. What I'm trying to say is that we have to make a clear stance and think about that problem from our perspective. And we have to be careful not to waive human rights in the interest of economic prosperity. I'm speaking about us, about ourselves, about our perspective. I'm not speaking about how human rights are violated in China. That would be a totally different discussion. What I am worried about is that it is tolerated to have this philosophy that in order to have prosperity, we have to disregard human rights. And this is going to backfire because the economic prosperity then will be standing above human rights in any decision making. And I have been observing this for decades, and this is becoming a stronger and stronger tendency. And it is obvious, especially vis-a-vis China, because there it is very apparent. And China takes advantage of it and tries to cultivate this type of thinking, this type of discourse, and tries to lure large businesses for these big profits. But it was also said that many Czech companies did business in China on a very decent and solid level, and they never got involved in any controversial situations. Specifically then, if we speaking about Czech foreign policy over the last several years, perhaps it was built on the human rights ethos. How, maybe it's not the case today, but it was the case in the past. But how does it go hand in hand with the fact that even at that time we were exporting guns and arms to countries like Saudi Arabia? So is that what you're talking about, that you still put prosperity higher than human rights? Isn't that the same situation? it is even more complex, and I'm not going to sound as a defender of arms trade with Saudi Arabia. I am saying that this business was happening it was happening on the level of the business, and it did not touch the level of human rights. So it's not like we would have waived human rights in the interest of that business. Do you have something to say, Mr. Šitler? Since I've been working in Sweden the last few years, I don't see a ethical problem when it comes to exporting guns or arms there. But when it comes to the arms trade with Saudi Arabia, that's a different story, because the Middle East is a mixture of allies of the West, and which regroup themselves differently, and some of them may not serve as the best example of human rights record. But Iraq, the Kuwait crisis, today ISIS. In fact, in the long run, in Saudi Arabia, that's the country which is seen as an ally of the West in all these other crises. So it is a question here. It is very, very difficult and very problematic, and I am not a specialist on that region, so I may not give you the most sophisticated answer, but you gave us a very, very difficult question when it comes to arms trade with Saudi Arabia. Well, I shouldn't give you easy questions, but it is complicated when it comes to Saudi Arabia, but on the other hand, arms are exported to that country by all members of the EU, including Sweden, which has been already mentioned. And in all those countries, a debate is conducted around this, and then in the long run, we do export them there. Mr. Pasko, in addition to what you have described about how Russian authorities deal with successful businesses and what it brings about for the Russians and for Russia, what is your experience? From your experience, what is the approach to human rights and prosperity in Russia? Are there situations where these two things can go hand in hand, or are they in contradiction?
I am led to believe that for the economic prosperity, it is important to put human rights as a priority. You cannot deprive people from their rights using protection of state interests as an excuse. Deprivation of internet communication and other freedoms lead to increased dependence of people on the state and empowering of the state. So I agree with the professor. You cannot use state interests as an excuse, and state should not ban business in other countries. Of course, entrepreneurs should be warned. Of course, you can be detained, you can lose your company. Yes, entrepreneurs should be warned. Khodorkovsky is still fighting for his business interests. International courts in London are flooded with these cases. Let us not forget that arms trading should be a state prerogative. Private business should not trade with arms. A Russian trader who's imprisoned has not manufactured arms. Arms are manufactured only by state-owned companies in Russia. As for the ethical problems, there are no such problems in Sweden in trading with arms, but in other spheres there are ethical problems in Sweden. I have investigated the Nord Stream 1 project. It was a sham project. I know how the Russian party intimidated the Swedes, and Russians said that they would close down IKEA and Volvo outlets in Russia. Russians did bribe the Gotland villages and municipalities. Russia promised funding of music projects in Sweden, and Sweden accepted it and provided its territorial waters to Russia. Sweden, yes, but I've followed the Swedish debate in Sweden. It was highly interesting. The Swedish government and the Ministry of Defense of Sweden were clear enough. They looked for ways how to prevent the permits, but they are a democratic country, and of course the municipalities, the local levels do have their powers as well, and it may be in the scope of their authority to approve it. And you understand that to lease a port to a business is a very nice business opportunity, and it is difficult to resist it. So the ducts, the Nord Stream, should not cross Swedish territorial waters. So let me correct this. It passes the zone that is not a part of Sweden. It's not the territorial waters of Sweden. So what was leased was the ports, and the government tried to persuade the municipalities not to lease the ports. In Gotland, in the end, Russians were rejected. They received a red light there. You do not represent Sweden here, don't you? No, I don't. But I want to support them because I have monitored the debate. Please, should you want to ask a question or comment on something, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone. It's coming. Thank you. Thank you very much. We are talking about human rights. And we have to admit that rights come hand in hand with obligations. Therefore, we have moral and ethics. These are ridiculed today. It is necessary to understand that moral and ethics are important and useful. Benjamin Disraeli, as a first politician, admitted that there's no morals in politics because there what brings profit to UK is moral. But history teaches us that this may bring a short-term profit, but it backfires, and the future generations usually have to pay for it. morals and ethics is not working here. Children are not raised under the umbrella of ethics and morals. There's no morals and ethics in the media, in the government. Then they answered that the
TV a podobné projekty, ale nemají tak.
The viewership rate is important, and of course the public corporations should have other goals than a number of viewers. And why don't we talk about the Chinese reality, Chinese environment? I had the opportunity to talk to chairman of one of the Chinese institutes, and he told me we were progressed. We have built the Chinese wall to be able to use the achievements of Chinese culture among ourselves, but it of course was very negative. We were not able to learn from the others, so we opened and we go outside. Why do media why don't media talk about this? Well, it is too courageous to say this to Professor Lomová, as she is very active in the media. Well, countries who believe that human rights are fundamental, do such countries have a right to disseminate this? Do they have a right to say to the other countries or to their own entrepreneurs, you're not doing it well? So, Ambassador, yes, yes is the answer. Yes. Thank you. What am I asking about? Where's the border? Where's the line between the logical dissemination of your belief of what is the best for people, and between the intervention in the internal affairs of a country? As I said in the introduction, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not a Western invention, Western documents. People from all over the world were engaged in its drafting, and they brought in their various cultural stands and religious convictions. It is not a Western product or a US product. The declaration stipulates or lays down the rights of all people of the world. It is universal. And Chinese living in Taiwan do not feel that human rights and democracy are in conflict with their culture. So it would be wrong to say that this is a basic model that we should disseminate, spread all over the world. Or, well, in particular, in the case of the Czech Republic, we have re-established our democracy back in 1989. And I can remember how useful it was when our socialist government has been reminded of human rights in the socialist regime. I owe thanks, or we owe thanks to those who have reminded our former government of human rights. Mr. Pasko, do you agree? Very many representatives of Western countries do that. So, do you feel such gratitude if somebody from the West comes in and says you should comply with human rights? Well, it is my own experience that it is useful. However, in the past 15 years, Russia does not listen to such advice. Russia even says that it shall not respect the ruling of the Strasbourg Court of Justice. Why, says Russia, this is our internal business. Russia exports not only arms, but aggression and hatred. I travel all over the world and I can see how people perceive Russia. They say, aha, so you come from Russia. Your president is not okay. He's been in his position for 18 years. Aha, so that is the best reaction. I've also heard, yes, there will be problems in Russia and in Romania. And this is because Russia does not respect human rights and exports hatred and evil. And this is bad for the ordinary people, for the business, and for the state. China and its representatives, how do they perceive people who are telling them from the outside that we emphasize human rights? Do they believe that it is some kind of softness? I want to say that not everyone is aware of the fact that China is an old civilization, but as of the beginning of the 20th century, they modernize and they follow the European development. Chinese elites do emphasize that. They've compared themselves against the European civilization in the 19th century, and the Chinese elite has decided to transform Chinese society and follow the European development. And the communist system has been imported to China. It is one of the consequences of this transformation. This is my favorite topic, and unfortunately I don't have time enough to mention all the aspects of this development and some domestic tradition in China that helps them to adopt the imports or imported ideas. Human rights at the beginning of the 20th century have become a target, and they develop towards this target the whole 20th century. And Chinese political representatives have incorporated the human rights idea into the ideology of the Communist Party of China, however, in their own interpretation. And the idea of human rights has been rejected by the Chinese representatives later on. I'm very glad I heard the name of the Chinese co-author of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because nobody knows about him in China. So let me come back to my idea. Chinese communist leadership started to be concerned about the human rights idea, and this is because they saw the breakdown of Soviet Union, and they started to understand that human rights, to an extent, were the root cause or cause of the breakdown of the communist power. And they started to emphasize that this is an idea strange to China, and that Chinese tradition shall not be dictated from the West. Chinese tradition, and their interpretation, is the Stalinist system, which is still the basic structure or skeleton of the society. And my second remark is the following. They can see they means political leadership of the Republic of China. They see our weaknesses and they are able to use it. We also do not comply with human rights principles 100% always. So we are not united. And China sees it and uses the slaughter. So those who are against the resolutions against human rights infringements in China harm all of us. And we are to be blamed for not respecting human rights always. If we would respect human rights always, we would be able to see that this is a benefit, and we would be able to say that we comply. And China uses this opportunity and takes over the right of discourse. This is their plan. Until now, the West has enforced the right of discourse on China. Now China takes over. And you should see what is the position of an individual in China. Dignified life is of great value all over the world, but not in the Chinese law, not in this interpretation of human rights. And I think that we should really promote human rights in China. It is working, but we have to be consistent. Ambassador, question for you. And your
podvelvyslance tehdy spadali, pokud se
and your career in Southeast Asia, because you had 4 countries, yes, Thailand, Cambodia, Burma, and Laos. As a representative of the Czech Republic in those countries, can you say that the situation there was similar to China? How did they perceive human rights as a weakness of those who are coming new? In Burma at that time, it was a clearly military regime. Today we have a hybrid government mixture of a military junta with democratic institutions, and at that time the regime was very aggressive. Any mention of human rights, the Burmese representatives then were prepared to terminate the discussion, but it had no impact or influence on trade, so it didn't really matter that much. In Thailand, when I was there at that time, there was an elected government, and there was always some partial criticism of this government, and they would try to respond and explain That was a normal dialogue. In Laos, this was like traveling back in time. It was a very very obsolete type of government, speaking just in cliches, and sort of no real dialogue taking place at that time. Then there, they would just answer whatever was expected, and then they went back to the party bureau. We are about to finish our panel, and it was the honor that the ambassador had to have the last word. We had this panel on which Professor Olga Lomová spoke, Russian journalist Grigory Pasko, and the Czech ambassador to Sweden, Mr. Šitler. Thank you all for coming here, for your attention, and you can see we have a 15-minute coffee break, and after that the third panel is going to take place. Thank you.